that we know that that Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. That was the first temple. There was a second temple, and then there was Herod's temple. Mm-hmm. And now everyone is waiting for the third temple. So we have a lot of evangelical Christians who are really insisting that the third temple should be built as soon as possible, because that would usher in the second coming.
Right.
So there's this connection of the temple. It's very strong in Christianity, in some Christian groups, although I've talked to a lot of Christians who don't know what I'm talking about. But some Christians, for them, the temple is very important. Of course, for Judaism, it's very important. I once made the statement that, to me, the Solomon's temple, the loss of the temple, and the loss of the Ark of the Covenant, was the phantom limb of the Jewish people. Here was a direct connection to God and to their own history. The history of Moses coming out of the desert. There was manna collected in the Ark of the Covenant. There was all of the physical evidence of what the Jews had gone through after they left Egypt was there, and then it disappeared, and the temple itself was destroyed. So, as I researched more, and I researched the Qumran sect, the people who kept the Dead Sea Scrolls, their writings are obsessed with the temple, and they were forbidden, or they forbade themselves from belonging to the Jerusalem sect, Herod's temple. They had arguments with Herod's temple. They thought the Herod priests were impure. They were doing things incorrectly, not according to Jewish law. So they kind of created a visualized temple. They had rituals in which they visited the temple, but a spiritualized temple. And then later on, we have, more recently, we have the same guy who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, Paul Bunyan, who wrote a book called Solomon's Temple Spiritualized. And he was talking about the visualization of the temple, that the temple existed on a spiritual plane, and that you could enter this temple spiritually, even though it had been removed physically. And I think this is the secret temple. This is what Freemasonry was connected to, which to me is further evidence that the Knights Templar were involved. The Templars, as we know, were at Solomon's Temple. That's where they got their name from. Mm-hmm. They were based at Solomon's Temple. Their function was to protect pilgrims, ostensibly, in the Holy Land. Although there were only 9 of these guys, how they were going to do that, they could barely protect themselves. But they were stationed in Jerusalem at the temple, and of course they became a very powerful chivalric order. They came back to France. They had the blessings of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a mystic himself who was obsessed with Solomon and with the Song of Solomon, wrote all sorts of sermons and homilies on the subject of Solomon's temple and the Song of Solomon itself. So there was this weird, esoteric, mystical element to the Knights Templar. The identification with the temple was very strong. It was in their name. And then they were suppressed by the church. You see, so in a sense, the Masons are a kind of visualization of the Knights Templar, just as the Templars were based at Solomon's Temple, at the remains of it. In a sense, the Masons now were bringing the Templars back to life in a spiritualized fashion. And I believe that the murder of Hiram Abif in the 3rd degree may be more a memory of the murder of Jacques de Molay, the execution of de Molay, than it really is Hiram Abif, the builder of the temple. But of course, Freemasons would have a real hard time with that explanation. But I've been looking at the documentation. I've been looking at the everything from the Dead Sea Scrolls to Merkaba mysticism, the idea that you rise on the plane 7 levels, and reach the throne of God. This was all part also of the Qumran sect of the Dead Sea Scrolls authors. So I see that the temple is crucial to an understanding of Freemasonry, and I think that their understanding of the temple is important. We need to understand what they think, the temple represents.
Speaking of the temple now, anyone who's read the Old Testament can read the description of the 2 pillars outside the temple. Is it Boaz and Jachin and Boaz? Jachin and Boaz, which are mirrored in Freemasonic lodges all around the world.
Absolutely.
What do those 2 pillars represent?
Well, it depends who you talk to. This is the problem with Freemasonry, right? It kind of depends who you talk to. I mean, if you talk to a Kabbalistically oriented Freemason, they're going to say it represents the pillars of severity and mercy. which is on the tree of life, the famous Kabbalistic symbol of the cosmology, of the cosmos. These could be also the pillars that Samson, brought down when he brought down, when he was destroying the temple. It wasn't Solomon's temple, but anyway. I mean, they have all kinds of different levels and layers of meaning to the two pillars, but they call them by the same names. So they're called Yachin and Boaz. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. It's a direct reference to the temple. They talk about a winding staircase, which is the second degree ritual, in which you go from the first floor to the second floor of the temple. And this is alluded to also in the Bible, that there were different floors to the temple. The Holy of Holies is referred to. The Book of the Law is the Bible. I mean, they're insisting in the original rituals that there is this very close connection between Moses, Solomon, and Freemasonry. In fact, the earliest initiation rituals make that connection clearer. They talk about the Freemasons being identified with the children of Israel leaving Egypt, and that the children of Israel learned from the Egyptians how to build temples. They learned sacred geometry. So there's this emphasis on sacred geometry from the very earliest documents of Freemasonry, that what they're concerned about is divine proportion. If you read the accounts by architects, modern-day architects, of how Chartres Cathedral in France, for instance, was built, a Templar cathedral, we might say, a cathedral built at that time, you will see the various stages of the work progressed in the hands of masons who had in their possession rulers that were considered sacred. The measurement was considered sacred. And you pass down from father to son your measuring stick, because that measuring stick was the key to building the temple. And all you needed was that measuring stick and a very rudimentary compass. And using your knowledge of geometry and divine proportion, you could start building a cathedral. You might die in the process. You might get very old and die. Someone else will pick up after you. Train somewhere else, but using the same implements, continue your work undisturbed down through centuries. Yes.
A mystical, spiritual aspect to this. I mean, it's not like, construction today where it's,
right.
You bring in the contractors, they pour the concrete, lay the foundation, and so forth. There was a mystical component to this.
Oh, very much so. It was mysticized to the extreme. That's why the Masons in those days, before there were so-called Freemasons, the Masons were organized into guilds, and they protected their secrets, and they had recognition symbols. A Freemason was unique among workers in Europe in those days, because a Freemason was free because they were not tied to one specific territory, to one prince or to one ruler. Their knowledge was considered so valuable and so important. They were allowed to go from region to region, bringing their knowledge with them and building a church here or a palace over here or whatever, a government building over there. They had this knowledge with them. And if a new Mason showed up in your village, there were recognition symbols. There were passwords, there were grips. In order to be secure in the fact that this person was not going to steal your secrets, this person already had the secrets. You were part of this universal brotherhood. So the idea of brotherhood that cut across regional and ethnic lines was already there in the Masonic guilds before Freemasonry as we know it was created. And it was based on this idea of sacred geometry, a kind of sacred science of proportion.
Going all the way back to Pythagoras?
Yes, according to the Masons, back to Pythagoras, back further than Pythagoras, back to the builders of the pyramids.
Is Solomon's Temple then itself just an image for the construction of the pyramids? Well, in other words, do they say that it's Solomon's Temple, but at another level you're taking it back even further to Egypt?
Well, the earliest Masons did. The earliest Masons saw the earliest Freemasons, the earliest Masonic Society documents show that they believed that what they had was the elements of the science that built the pyramids, that Moses was an initiated Egyptian priest who brought this information with him out of Egypt and then brought it to the rest of the Middle East. So there's this concept that the sacred geometry came out of Egypt. The actual building of Solomon's Temple, we know from the Bible, was a kind of a collaborative effort between Solomon and Hiram of Phoenicia, right? So there was this connection between another Hiram, not Hiram Abiff, who built the temple, but Hiram, the king Hiram of Tyre, I think, who then gave some of his elements, some of his architectural elements, some of his instructors, some of his architects he sent over to Solomon. So we have essentially, no matter how you want to look at it, a kind of pagan temple, which was the prototype for Solomon's temple. But to the Freemasons, this went back even further. To the Freemasons, yes, there were these elements from Tyre, but actually what Moses brought over, what David had and Solomon had, were the elements of a sacred geometry, a sacred science. Hence the Masonic idea of God as the great geometer, the grand architect of the universe. They actually identify this sacred science with God, with a sacred knowledge, with a special spiritualized knowledge.
Is there any connection between Freemasonry and the esoteric writings of John Dee, for example, or rather Francis Bacon, let's say? One of the theories floated about the Freemasons involves the New Atlantis, and that the design of Washington, D.C., the Masonic imagery, symbolism built into either the street layout and or the buildings of our federal government are part of a grand plan to recreate the lost continent.
Well, there's a lot of that going around these days. There's a lot of that idea going around, and I think that there are certainly elements of it. Another researcher, William Henry, has written at length on this very subject. He's been very much taken by the Capitol building and the design of the Capitol building, where the apotheosis of George Washington at the very top of the dome of the Capitol pretty much spells out the idea that this was supposed to be the New Atlantis and the New Jerusalem, for that matter, that Washington was conceived that way. Another person I know, James Wasserman's written a book on Masonic Washington, a kind of guidebook to Masonic Washington, replete with photographs, and he comes to pretty much the same conclusion, that the founding fathers were trying to create here Francis Bacon's idea of a new Atlantis, a utopia, and a new Jerusalem. And all of these ideas were coming together in the thought of these various individuals, which is why there was a degree of stress between the Masons of America, of our early American history, and the so-called Illuminati cult, because they saw the Illuminati as purely revolutionaries without purpose. They saw the Illuminati as people who wanted to tear everything down, but didn't have a plan for building anything up. So there was a kind of tension between the two. And George Washington himself repudiated the Illuminati. Thomas Jefferson was fascinated by them. He read whatever he could about them. But I think he also, although he had some, I think, a grudging admiration for some of the basic ideas of the Illuminati, he realized that what they were trying to do was take over Freemasonry, for their own ends, and use Freemasonry as a kind of revolutionary, network of cells that we would call, like terrorist cells, we would call them today, to create just general anarchy. So whether that was true or not, of course, historians will disagree. But and it's important to point out that we don't think Thomas Jefferson himself was a Freemason. Franklin was, of course, and Washington was. John Adams was not. But they all pretty much had sympathy for each other's ideas. None of them seemed to have sympathy for the Illuminati.
The pillars, according to Bacon, then, how would they factor into his imagery of the New Atlantis?
Wow, that's a very deep question, and a very specific one. Let me think for a second. Well,
I mean, is it something as simple as Atlantis, according to Plato, being just located beyond the Pillars of Hercules?
If you could look at it that way, that the pillars represent, the Pillars of Hercules, and that Atlantis, of course, lies outside. When we look at the Hebrew, the way the Masons translate Yakin and Boaz, it's Yakin is usually translated as "he shall establish," and Boaz, "in it is strength." However, it's still a little ambiguous, in terms of real, genuine Freemasonry. They're trying to just duplicate the temple. If we think of Francis Bacon and his idea of